I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. Today is Monday, April 17th, 2023. Got a great show for you today. I'll be talking with Taibi Magar. She's director of An American Tale, the musical. It's opening soon at Children's Theater Company in South Minneapolis. Also today, Judge LaJune Lange, president of International Leadership Institute. We're here today talking about a neighborhood community recognition preservation project. The project is called the Longfellow Journey Longfellow Our Journey documentary, and we'll talk about that project as well. Before we get into the interviews, two things. One, I want to invite you to support this work, this program, by subscribing. And you go to the YouTube Insight News channel, subscribe, like it, share it, tell your friends that we do this every day at 1 o'clock. We have a lot of fun. We hope that you have fun. We hope that you enjoy what I call robust conversation. And the excitement is that it's like, two people talking or three people talking. But what I'm aware of is that these private, personal conversations are staged so that the whole world can listen in, lean in, and be a part of it. So we want you to be part of this conversation. Lean in and share. I mean, what you can do actually is make comments on, if you're on YouTube or if you're watching on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, there is a comment section, and we want to hear your voice. We want to acknowledge you as well. So wherever you are, if you want to say hello to us and tell us where you're connecting from. We start the program with the hot topics, and the ones I have today are both very sad. Two things. One, I've been watching over the weekend the story about the 4 young victims killed at an Alabama Sweet 16 party. And an assailant went to a Sweet 16 party and just unloaded. And this is a story by Holly Yan and Isabel Rosales and Chris Boyette, Elizabeth Wolf, all of CNN. Today's published today, and the dateline is Dadeville, Alabama, and it says, they've identified the 4 victims who were killed at a Sweet 16 birthday party in Alabama over the weekend. I'm not going to share their names at this point, but you can find that in the story. And it says at least 15 other teens were also shot and hospitalized Saturday night in Dadeville, which is a close-knit city of around 3,000 people. Investigators are asking for information about whoever turned this joyous celebration into a scene of carnage. Sergeant Jeremy Burkett of the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency said, I cannot stress this enough. We absolutely need you to share the information. Well, shortly, just briefly, the gunfire erupted around 10:34 Saturday night in a event venue in downtown Dadeville. And there wasn't any apparent fight or disturbance before the shooting. And the story goes on. I'll stop there. That's one. That's sad. So we have to look at this, guns in our community and gun violence. Well, you all know that I'm a native of Kansas City, Missouri, so this story touches me personally. The second one is a piece by Tina Burnside and Amanda Jackson, again, at CNN, story updated a few minutes ago on CNN. And it says, accused shooter in Kansas City shooting of a black teen who went to the wrong house is a white man in his 80s. This is a breaking news update. It says a white man in his 80s is the individual who apparently shot and seriously wounded Ralph Yari, a black teen, on April 13th in Kansas City, Missouri, according to a CNN review of property records, police statements, and detention records. CNN is not naming the man at this time. given that he has not been charged. The two representatives of the Kansas City Police Department Detention Unit read the man's booking information to CNN over the phone. They confirmed the man who was booked on an investigation hold was a white man in his 80s and in his home address. And his home address matches the address where the shooting took place. They said he was taken into custody on April 13th and released after a couple of hours on April 14th. So sad. And there's a picture of this young kid with a saxophone and apparently, artistic, creative, gifted. Prayers to him and to those families impacted in the other incident in Alabama as well. Well, let me proceed with today's program. That's kind of a bummer. It really is a bummer to report on that. Despite that, we have to keep moving and figure out how we elevate and illuminate and focus on things that bring us hope and bring us peace of mind, clarity in different ways. I think that this program is going to do that because I'm pleased to have met and to begin talking with my guest from the Children's Theater production, Taibi Magar is here. Taibi, good afternoon. Welcome to the conversation. How you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, children's theater is one of my favorite places. It's a huge and beautiful institution, not only in Minnesota, but around the country. And before we talk about your show there, let's talk about children's theater and why children's theater is important. Even after my opening, what healing there is that comes from institutions like the theater and children's theater in particular.
Absolutely. Thrilled to be able to talk about this. Obviously theater affected my life. I chose it as my profession and I've been dedicated to it since I was 12 or something. But I think even if you don't work in the theater, I think the theater is a social tool. It's a tool for community and a tool for conversation. In ancient Greek times, as a citizen, you were required to go to the theater. It was thought of as an essential part to democracy, as an essential part to community conversation and organizing. And I'm not here to say theater can solve poverty or solve gun violence, but I do think theater is the only art form where you're literally asked as a performer and asked as witnessing performance to watch somebody else step into each other's shoes. It's a literalizing act of radical empathy and community. My personal artistic manifesto, I guess, is what the theater can offer us is the skill of imagination, right? It has this really unique and powerful way performance to turn a milk jug into a baby, right? The way an actor can just transform an object, or with we're about to head into technical rehearsals where all of the theatrical magic starts to come together, and using, somewhat humble tools, right? We don't have CGI. It happens live and in front of you. We are able to transform the audience's imagination. And for me, the biggest thing is that imagination and social justice are entirely intertwined. If you can't imagine it, you can't fight for it, right? And I feel like the theater is a place where that skill of imagination, both for the people making it, but also for the people receiving it, I think it's an incredible part of our lives. And to just speak to what theater can do for young audiences and the way that it can harness their imagination, their incredible imagination that I think gets slowly drained out of them over time. But theater is a useful tool to heighten that. And the children's theater, I mean, it's the premier children's theater of our art form. It's a big, robust, it sends its productions everywhere. I mean, the fact that almost every kid in Minnesota has been to that theater no other state can say that. And
Mhm.
I remember sitting down with Joe Hodge at the Guthrie. Sorry, then I'll stop talking. But and the Guthrie was so robust, and you had such an incredible theater community actually here in Minneapolis. And he linked it to children's theater, that it becomes a ritual, a habit of theater going, of gathering, of
Mhm.
talking about empathy and how to be a good person. And don't we need that now more than ever?
We certainly do. Well, let me tell people a little bit more about you. Taibi Magar is a director of An American Tale, the musical, which is going to be opening shortly at Children's Theater. And she's a nationally renowned theater director and has had many episode credits that include Nora. I think that's the right word. And maybe I'm saying this, and proud to present at
Mhm.
the Guthrie, and is Familiar We Are a third production?
Familiar is the name by Denai Barrera. Yeah,
Okay, great, great. So therefore the reference to the Guthrie in this opening remark. And now this play, this is, I think, a kind of a world premiere.
yeah,
So
yeah.
let's get into An American Tale, the musical. Tell us about it, how it came to your attention and to the attention of the theater. How is it coming to life here in Twin Cities?
Yeah. So the movie premiered in 1986. It's an
Mhm.
animated film, a sort of fable about a family of mice who are Russian Jewish refugees who get attacked by the cats, and the cats make them flee Europe, and they end up on a ship in on the way to America when they get separated. There's a storm, and they end up in Manhattan, and little Fievel, who's our sweet sort of growing up anti-hero, is trying to find his family, and the family is trying to find him. And he learns about Manhattan, he learns about American culture, and he meets other refugees and immigrants along the way. And you meet Irish immigrants, you meet Italian immigrants who are new during this time. It's like 18. And you just sort of follow this mouse as they take on the cats in America, who tend to be these sort of like capitalistic forces that are
Mhm.
shaping Manhattan. So that's the story. And I wore this VHS tape out when I was a kid. It has some incredible songs that some people might be familiar with. There Are No Cats in
Mm-mm.
Out There is a huge hit. It's actually a big crossover hit. I think Linda Ronstadt and someone else was saying the duet. Yeah, so it's actually the story of Steven Spielberg's own family. He was a producer, story developer on it. This is early days, but yeah, and a couple years ago, Playbill.com, which is our trade magazine,
Mhm.
released the news that Children's Theater had acquired the rights to it. And I saw it and I thought, oh, that's such a good idea. I'll never work on that. Like, that's too good to. But through a series of circumstances, I was brought onto it, and yeah, it's been really meaningful. It's an incredible story. It's theatrically really delicious. There were 4 songs in the movie. Universal said take what you want, and we took 3 of them. But we
Okay.
built out a whole score, so now there's a full, I think, 12 or 13 numbers now. Yeah.
It's a fairly large cast, isn't it, or not? As
Yeah, yeah.
theater casts go. Talk about the production. I mean, as I was reading the press release, it listed all of the principal, the adults, and the student actors, and then the understudies, and it seemed like a lot of people, and a lot of people from set design
Yeah.
to all the other roles that make. I mean, as an audience member, you don't think about all the complexity of producing these
That's,
special moments. But reading the press release, you say, "Holy Moses!" There's a lot going on here. So,
yeah, yeah.
so talk about the cast first of all, and how you develop the cast and what people bring to the roles that they play. I'm always curious about how artists themselves become transformed as they do their craft. and hopefully transform audiences as well. What are your thoughts? Just any way you want to take that, just flow with me on it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Happy to. I mean, yeah, theater is, I think it's often we don't tell the story enough to our audiences about how actually incredibly handmade the object of what we make is. It's
Mhm.
incredibly labor intensive. I went to for a costume design. Costumes are incredible. Our costumes are done by really one of my favorite costume designers in the world, actually lives here in Minneapolis. Trevor Bowen. I'm sure if you've been to the theater here in Minneapolis, you've seen his work at the And I walked into the shop of the costumes, and there's like 10 crafts people working on all of these different costumes. Theater actually is a great generator of jobs and an incredible art form for that reason. But yeah, so there's tons of people working in the shop. We also so the cats are these sort of fabulistic, like the evil villains of the story, but
Mhm.
they're puppets in our production. So we have a whole local puppet designer, Christopher Lutter, who's an incredible local designer. I didn't know him before this process, but we're very lucky to have him. But yeah, there's the set designer, there's the lighting designer, there's even a local amazing person, Talvin Wilkes, who is a professor at University of Minnesota. He's also an incredible director and administrator, and just a really genius artist. And he did some really amazing work with us that I'd love to talk about for a little bit, which is, in revisiting the film when I was first brought on board, I hadn't watched it in a while. It'd been, 35 years, and it was clear to me that the lens that Spielberg was looking at New York and New York
Mhm.
immigrants was relatively limited to white cultures, ethnicities, races. Um,
Mhm.
who conveniently, I don't know, forget that there were Black people there. There were Asian people in Manhattan during this time.
Mhm.
They were forming communities also. And what we brought Talvin in, and the writers and I worked really long and hard to sort of expand that lens of
Mhm.
who an immigrant could be in Manhattan. So we did some
Mhm.
adjusting around characters. We made Bridget, who's sort of the fierce activist, a Black woman whose parents recently migrated from the South, and sort of taken that into the fable world. I mean,
Mhm.
she's still a
Mhm.
mouse, they're mice, but
Mhm.
I think it's a way more inclusive storytelling of Manhattan at that time, and that's felt really meaningful. And Talvin was instrumental in helping us. He helped us with all the rich research. I mean, we spent years on this, right? Like
Sure.
years of. Did I go out? Oh no.
You did, yeah, but you're dropping every now and then, but it's okay, I think. We'll still, yeah.
But, so I'm really proud of the work that Talvin has helped us with, and I'm really proud of the story that we're telling on stage. Yeah.
Mhm. You told me before we went on that the story has a personal feeling or connection to you because your dad is from Egypt, right?
Yeah.
And had the same story that's being told is kind of his story, fleeing Egypt. Tell about that. So how does this become personal to your family, your own experience?
Yeah, yeah. It was funny because we were a year into developing this piece when it actually dawned on me. But so the family is on a ship, and they encounter a storm. This isn't a spoiler; it happens very early in the play. But and they get separated and sort of swim through the ocean and arrive on Manhattan at different points. But my own father, he was 17, and Egypt. The revolution had just happened, and Britain had left, and sort of a really politically complicated time as the country was moving into a form of socialism. My own family was Coptic Christian. They live about 30. Um, and we're encountering a lot of challenges with that as
Mm.
this country was wrestling with who they are. And my grandfather kind of got sent to a labor camp. My grandmother had a really hard time and ended up in a mental hospital. So my dad really felt like he had no options. Economically, there was not a lot. He didn't see a lot of way forward in the country. And he traveled up to Alexandria, and he waited for a month. He went to the dock every single day and waited for someone to make a mistake. Finally, someone did, and he snuck on board a ship and hid, and basically got found out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea and jumped. And he had nothing. He had, and he swam to the shore of Lebanon. And there was a guard there. And, he's like, what do I do? Do I try to lie? How do I, this guard is clearly here to prevent people from me, doing what I'm doing. Sure. And he decided, sort of a fable in our story, but in our family story, but he decided to tell the truth. And in doing so, the guard said, he could have arrested him or, done a million things, but he said, wait here, there's a group of boys over there. And when they leave, just follow them behind the gate. And he let him through, and he welcomed him and had his own version of welcoming him. And my dad lived in the back of a bakery for 2 years in Lebanon and swept the floors for food until he got papers to come to America. And all that to say, there was a welcome inside of that security guard that I think this play is asking us all to have to our refugees. No one wants to leave their country. I feel like that's the thing that gets lost. You're leaving your family, you're leaving what you know, you're leaving your ancestors, you're leaving your culture. You don't take these trips lightly. And I feel like that often gets very lost in our refugee and immigrant stories. So having that personal connection just helps me connect the dots more thematically. And I think I've made a lot of space in rehearsal because a lot of us have those kinds of stories in our family. For us all to sort of talk about how many of us have these backgrounds in our own sort of refugee stories. Yeah, so it's been really meaningful.
Interesting. For two reasons. You're connecting with me the idea of recognizing this notion of refugee ist. My mother is from Mississippi, and she had described herself as not a refugee, but a person who escaped when she left, because when she left, she and sisters had to leave at night because they were sharecroppers, right? And that they, in a sense, were almost bound to the land or the property. And so it was an act of courage to steal away at nighttime, So, that's interesting. So, and what you've done is brought that element of movement, not only from foreign shores, but from within the country as well. That's really kind of cool. Yeah. Are there transformative moments? There must be, but would you describe what to you is a transformative moment in this play? And are there moments that surprise you where it was, I know you're looking to produce these aha moments that are magical, but sometimes they happen where you don't expect them.
Yeah. I'd say I love visual storytelling. I basically love set design. Like I love, that's probably why I chose what I do. And this was such a delicious process just because of scale, right? Like you have these little mice. We actually, I don't think, it's definitely not a secret, but the set designer just came in one day and was like, what if it all happens inside of a suitcase? So the whole theater, it basically looks like one big suitcase. And inside are all these little mice, and they're sort of like a suitcase theater. And it's just been great fun. And there's a sequence, a storyline about how Fievel gets sort of kidnapped into a sweatshop, and late one night we had them sitting on stools, this sweatshop, and I kept being like, stools, it's not right, it's keeping me up at night. And all of a sudden it was late at night. I couldn't sleep. I was like, they should be sitting on spools. So, oh, sorry. Did you lose me?
No, you're fine. Yeah. I mean, your voice, sometimes the screen might freeze for a second, but your voice is still good.
Oh, great. Yeah. So all of a sudden in the middle of the night, I'm like, spools, they must be sitting on spools that would tell the story of scale so beautifully. And I ran to the prop shop, because usually things like this, you have to ask for months in advance, because they take a lot of time to make. And our props designer, I thought she was going to be like, no, there's no time. And she said, we'll try. And last week she came in, she was like, I have your spools. That's so great. So those have been like delicious discoveries. But I think emotionally the biggest discovery is, I think, like the news that you were relaying at the top of the hour. I can get, and I imagine we've all had some moment of this. It can be really hard to believe in America these days, and it can be really frustrating. And part of the climax of the musical is Henri is this pigeon who's building a statue, and happens to be the Statue of Liberty. And in the beginning, it's unfinished, and then at the end, it's finished. And I spent a lot of the last few years, we've been developing this, like, wondering, is that like too hopeful? Like, have we earned that statue? Actually, I don't know. Do we earn the hope that this piece is asking us to have in this great experiment, America? And what's been uplifting in the moment is, we have this youth ensemble that we have, these professional young artists, and the diversity and the sort of immense imagination that these kids have, and their ambition and their focus and their rigor and their pure love for this art form has actually, like, I cry every time we run it now. It's like them standing in front of the Statue of Liberty. It makes me want to believe in the power of America, just watching these children work. It's like, it's done something for me spiritually in my relationship with America, where I can still get very mad at it, but it's made me want to fight for it.
Well, that's what hope is about, I think, and that's what faith and hope will do, is keep you focused on creating a future that elevates the best that we have in ourselves and for each other as well. A couple of last questions before I let you go. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. Have you had a chance to preview this in front of audiences yet? When do people come to see this the first time?
A week from tomorrow. I think it's our first preview is Tuesday, April 25th. We've had a series of workshops where some, friends and family of the Children's Theater have been involved. But
what's been the reaction so far for the few lucky people that've seen parts of it?
Yeah, they've been loving it. I mean, I really can't say enough about the writers. That adapting a film, first of all, extremely difficult. Adapting an animated film, even more difficult. There's so many things we can't do in theater. So you have to harness what theater has to offer, and they've just done an incredible job. The songs are incredible. The talent on stage is incredible. So yeah, come join us for the premiere.
What are the future plans for An American Tale, the musical? What's going to happen after the run at Children's Theater?
Oh, listen, we want it to go everywhere. I think it has such a powerful message, and it's such a fun piece of theater. And I think our hopes for it are really high, and we want it to reach as many people as possible. We're really excited. I'm sure this won't be the last production, but come see it while it's new, for sure.
So let's invite people to come to the opening and to enjoy it several times while it's running. Why don't you do that? And then I want to have you close on talking about Taibi Magar's future. What's down the road for you beyond this project?
Let's see. I run a theater company. I'm a co-artistic director at Philadelphia Theater Company. And I just started this past September, and we're launching our first season. So if you know anyone in Philadelphia who wants to come see some great theater, send them to Philadelphia Theater Company. But I also,
one of our
yeah,
producers is in Philadelphia, so I'll connect him with you.
oh,
He's,
good.
yeah,
Oh,
he's in.
yeah, great. Amazing. Yeah, no, Philly's a great town. So there's that, and then I have a wonderful show going up off Broadway this summer called The Half God of Rainfall. That is a really spectacular piece of theater around the intersection of Nigerian mythology and Greek mythology.
Wow.
So if you're in Manhattan, come on by.
I'm curious about that. That's another conversation.
Yeah.
Well, so invite people again. Let's extend the invitation.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So come
No,
to An American Tale. Yeah,
yeah.
April 25th, Children's Theater.
Taibi Magar, thank you so much. So good to meet you, and all the very, very best to you. Hello to my friend Peter Brocious and all the wonderful cast over there at Children's Theater.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
All right, we'll see you. I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. What a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with her. And, just this idea of what theater can do, what it means, and how it enables families, children, audiences, as she said, to put themselves in another person's shoes, and how it allows the creation of empathy, awareness, understanding, all of that and more. And the Children's Theater of Minneapolis, just a huge, huge organization. So support them, attend this show. Let me move to the second part of today's program. I see that my friend, the Honorable Judge LaJune Lange is here. And LaJune Lange is a former Hennepin County public defender, a former judge in Hennepin County, and also I think he presently is president of the International Leadership Institute. I'm going to ask her about all of those things over the course of the next half an hour in our conversation. But she's here today to talk about her work with a project in Longfellow, South Minneapolis neighborhood. It's a documentary called Longfellow, Our Journey documentary. And we wanted to welcome her and have her talk about her interest in the power, the importance, the need to elevate community. Judge LaJune, good afternoon. Welcome to the conversation. Thank you for being here. And how are you? And are you able to hear me okay?
Hello, Al. The volume is very low. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Okay, well, your volume is perfect on this side, so I hear you perfectly, and maybe you simply have to adjust your volume output on your machine, but hopefully you'll be able to hear me. But you're coming across very clear on this side. Good to see you again. It's been a while. Now, something happened and you're muted, so. Well, let's do this. You have to find the unmute button on your machine. And there we go. Oh, off, back on again. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Okay.
So I was saying it's been a while.
I'm very happy to be here this afternoon with you to talk about the work of the International Leadership Institute on our Longfellow project. We've been exploring the history of early African Americans, particularly those who came as slaves to Fort Snelling and those who came as what were later called contraband to Fort Snelling, people who fled the South in 1863 and came to Fort Snelling on steamships that were hired by Fort Snelling. I'm sure you've heard of Robert Hickman and many others from St. Paul, yes. But there's more to the story. Our research has shown that close to 600 African Americans came to Minnesota during that period around 1863. And what they were able to do was incredible. In less than 5 years, these families came to Minnesota and were able to get the Constitution of Minnesota changed so they could have the right to vote ahead of the federal protections that were provided later in the 15th Amendment. So we have in Minnesota, African descendant people have always been leaders and at the center of the American story. So our work is showing decade by decade these documentations with regard to African descendant people. So we're looking at the arrival on the banks of the Mississippi River of Dred Scott and looking at the arrival on the banks of the Mississippi River of the men and women and children labeled as contraband. So in the Longfellow Project, we've created a film. We've also had the opportunity to interview some of the descendants of those early families and actually through the assistance of Native American elders, find the locations where the oral history of Native Americans say these boats actually landed. So it's been a very, very important work. It's very emotional to meet some of these family members and interview their descendants and the stories that they have and held within their families. And to be able to take, we took one family from, I think you've heard of W. Harry Davis Sr. and his son,
Sure.
Harry Davis Jr.
Yeah, of course.
We took Harry Davis Jr. to Fort Snelling to retrace his great-great-grandfather's arrival in 1863 to Fort Snelling as a soldier. His great-grandfather had served in the Massachusetts 54th Regiment and also served in the General Army in the Civil War. So, and came to Minnesota, settled and raised a family. And so seeing those roots, being able to see, confirm the oral history of the family within the records of Fort Snelling was just an incredible opportunity to allow for Mr. Davis and his family.
Are you finding things that the families don't know, or the families discovering more about their own lineage as a result of this research that you're doing?
Well, we are continuing this work because there's so many families in, not only in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but Black families settled in Fergus Falls, they settled in Duluth, they settled in the southern part of Minnesota, all over the state. Mm-hmm. And so we're going area by area, looking at families. And of course, one of the families that you already heard about is the Cheatham family, the first known Black firefighter in the Minneapolis Fire Department. He also came in 1863 as part of that wave of escaped emancipators, those who wanted to get away as far as possible from slavery and get on the boats that were chartered by the Fort Snelling. Of course, Fort Snelling had a manpower shortage because many of the young men were already fighting in the Civil War. So they conceived this idea to be able to have additional Black workers. We have not been able to confirm that these workers were paid or not. We know that the other approximately 100 people over the years at Fort Snelling who were enslaved were in true slave labor. They did not even have beds to sleep in or slave shacks to lay their head. They had to sleep in the doorways at the fort and serve at the will of the officers they were assigned and bound to. So it has been an important thing to raise that whole issue of enslavement and the historic site of enslavement of Fort Snelling, which of course at that time encompassed the Hiawatha Golf Course and much of South Minneapolis. So many people, when they're out for a stroll, have no idea that they're walking on land that our ancestors were enslaved.
That's amazing. We've got a video, I think part of the documentary. We're going to show that and come back and talk about that. If you want to get that queued up, Yasmin, let's watch that now, and then we'll come back and continue the conversation with Judge LaJune Lange.
Well, we have been at the center of Minnesota.
This is Fort Snelling
Both
State Park, what used to be Dakota land, and what they believe was a place of creation. This same land would be the origin of many African American roots in Minnesota. In 1863, the Davenport and Northerner brought more than 500 newly freed enslaved men, women, and children from the South. The boats docked right here. Their ropes were tied around these very trees, leaving century-old scars in the wood. In the oral tradition of the Dakota people, it is said that the boat that brought Dred Scott to Minnesota anchored to one of these trees. Our history is rarely told, but we've been here all along. So where did we go from here?
Well, that's interesting. That's fascinating.
Yes, we want to lift up our history. It's there, but it's been in the cupboard. So we're trying to unlock the cupboard and bring our presence and our narrative to our children, to our city officials, to the country, to show that we've been here all the time.
Talk about how this fits into your vision and your work, and as a project of the International Leadership Institute. You working around the world on the issue of justice and economic empowerment. What's the connection between this project, looking at the movement and memory of Africans formerly enslaved, from that system to the potential of freedom here in Minnesota? What's the connection to the overall broad scope of work of the International Leadership Institute?
Well, I think the two most important cases in the history of the United States in terms of human rights and African Americans are the Dred Scott case and the George Floyd cases. And by them occurring less than 3 miles apart on this same south side of Minneapolis, the same plot of ground where our ancestors have been, is of significance. The Dred Scott case impacted the world. It lit the spark for the Civil War and the aspiration of African Americans to be free. And George Floyd's case, the trials, the torture, the abuse was seen around the world, and it's still lighting a spark that will not be extinguished for human rights and protection and advancement of African descendant people, not only in Minnesota, but around the world. And so these two things happened within 3 miles of each other. Many people do not even know that Dred Scott lived in Minnesota. If they learned anything about it, which I learned in law school, the details, they said the law school book said the Wisconsin Territory. That was before Minnesota became a state. So nobody follows the geography to understand that's that same Fort Snelling that's out by the airport. So it's important to understand where we are with the whirlwinds of history. And we've been at the epicenter for almost 200 years, more than 200 years of important developments.
Take a minute, Judge LaJune, and talk about Dred Scott. You described it as a flashpoint, a spark for the Civil War. Somebody listening doesn't know what that means. So if you don't mind, give us a history lesson on Dred Scott and the Dred Scott decision and how that played into a seismic shift in the direction of the United States of America and of the world.
It's very important to know that Dred Scott's great-great-granddaughter has a Dred Scott Foundation in St. Louis. We, through Roxanne Givens and others, we were able to bring her up to Fort Snelling for the first time approximately 10 years ago, and she has made occasional visits since that time. But we want to introduce her to our children here in Minnesota and to more and more people, so that that link between Dred Scott being freed and suing in St. Louis and living in Minnesota, where it was the basis for his lawsuit for freedom, that connection remains visible and understood. And so we're very privileged to have the Dred Scott Foundation want to keep that connection and grow that connection in Minnesota. So it's going to be on our community, the African American community, to lift up the visibility and make that link. We should have at minimum statutes to Dred Scott in Minnesota, streets named after Dred Scott in Minnesota, but we as the African descendant community are going to have to take that initiative. Our organization, the International Leadership Institute, was able to save a formerly all-Black fire station at 4501 Hiawatha Avenue. It was made into a landmark by the city of Minneapolis, so it can't be destroyed. But that station represented intentional segregation by the city of Minneapolis to have Black firefighters serve in their own brigade. And of course, we know over time that history, after that fire station was closed, Blacks were closed out of the entire fire department for 30 years. So these things keep going in cycles. So we need to understand how important the history is to what happens in the future.
The film said this was the tree that the boat that brought Dred Scott anchored to. Talk about that, just a refresher. Who was Dred Scott? How did he come to Minnesota, and why? And why was his bid for freedom in the court so significant?
Dred Scott was very critical to the history of the United States, and particularly to African descendant people. Dred Scott had been enslaved at Fort Snelling and was forced to go to Missouri because he was summoned by Dr. Emerson. When Dr. Emerson passed away and the widow was there, Dred Scott and his wife attempted to buy their freedom. They had earned enough money from their independent time in Minnesota to be able to pay a fair price to be emancipated. But she had turned over the administration of her so-called enslaved people to her brother, and her brother refused to allow Dred Scott and Harriet to buy their freedom. They sued in the Missouri courts. They lost because, as we know, courts can face political pressure, and suddenly things that we call precedent or traditional decisions suddenly change. And in Missouri, the Supreme Court had changed their position of allowing someone to be liberated when they had lived in a free territory. So Dred Scott and Harriet Scott had to appeal their case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In the meantime, they had to hide their children so that their children wouldn't be grabbed up and sold into slavery somewhere else while they fought this case. So every step of the way was a hardship for the entire family. When Dred Scott got to the U.S. Supreme Court, the political situation was so fraught that the Supreme Court delayed the decision and asked them to come a second time to argue before the Supreme Court a second time. And so when they did that, the nation was even more on edge with regard to slavery. So history tells us that Justice Taney wrote his decision while running between the Supreme Court and the White House, trying to look at the political winds and how to word his decision for the political maximum of the party that he was loyal to. And of course, now, even our conservative Supreme Court admits the Dred Scott case was the worst decided case in the history of the Supreme Court, because they were trying to seek a political end and trampled on all of jurisprudence and rationality in the decision. So when I was in law school, the line that slapped me in the face was, "A black man has no rights that a white man's bound to respect." When I read that language, I'm like, we are at the root of white supremacy, coming from the mouth of the Supreme Court justices declaring open and unambiguously that we don't matter. And so everyone who was of courage in this country knew that that was a line that had gone too far. So we ended up watching our nation prepare and fracture for civil war, the assassination of a president, they try to undo the Freedmen's Bureau, the Reconstruction fighting. But here we are, we're still here, we're still fighting, we still understand the importance of full participation in this country that we helped create and sustain. And so being able to share these stories and daylight this history has been a real joy.
You've been doing a lot of work in Africa. Talk about the ILI's initiative in Africa, particularly the Southern Africa, Central Africa business initiatives.
Well, I think, Al, one of the things that we need to do in Minnesota is take credit for the incredible things that we've done and then build on that as an example for the future. This whole group of so-called contraband who came with just the clothes on their back in 1863, in less than 100 years, had achieved something in terms of home ownership, business ownership, doctors, lawyers, churches, community, in less than 100 years that we have never met. Now, today in 2023, we have a 50% lower home ownership than we did in 1950 for Black community. And so to know, it's part of our job to know, how did we lose so much ground? What happened? And so we look at freeway construction, which deliberately decimated our community. We look at so-called urban renewal programs, which deliberately decimated our community. We look at the Great Society program, which deliberately decimated our community and steered our community into a corral of rental housing so that there would not be net worth passed from one generation to another. A child age is 17 years old who got pregnant could get her own apartment. And we know now that we have so many single mothers whose net worth is only $5 because we have no ownership in any property, and we have no savings, and we have no safety net. And so knowing that our ancestors facing segregated hotels, segregated housing, lack of opportunity, were still able to collectively buy homes, build churches, recruit doctors to come here because of the segregation and the poor treatment. We have to be able to take some lessons from them to get out of the situation we're in now.
What's the relationship between Africans in this country and Africans in the continent? How do our fortunes and our futures correspond or relate, or are they linked in your point of view from your work at the Institute?
Well, I think one of the things we're learning from this research, for example, looking at W. Harry Davis, who came from 1863 Civil War veterans' descendants, W. Harry Davis lived in North Minneapolis. And at a certain point, he moved to South Minneapolis, but he never left North Minneapolis. He viewed his community as the whole city. So he worked and nurtured Phyllis Wheatley and those programs and the importance of the settlement house to be able to have wraparound services for individuals, have community space, have camping, horseback riding, things that brought peace, peace of mind, entry to the outdoors, brought a stabilization from the rat-infested slums. And so Harry stuck with that. He stuck with the boxing, and he also continued to build across the city in South Minneapolis, working on desegregating the Hiawatha Golf Course, and in turn desegregating the very neighborhood where the Hiawatha Golf Course was. So when you hear about the Hale and Field pairing, that was the same neighborhood that the Hiawatha Golf Course served. So we have just a dedication layer by layer to do the best for the children, but it didn't stop at a boundary in terms of whether you were a North Sider or South Sider. So I think that's an important piece of information that we can use, that Harry, part of his legacy.
And so I'm taking that to mean that if we say there's no boundary, then we have to look at the entire African community globally, North and South America and Africa, as ours in order to create, to connect, and to build and to transform. Judge LaJune Lange, thank you so much for being here. We're out of time right now. This has been a wonderful conversation. I would like to invite you back to go even deeper into these rich stories that you've uncovered and that you're creating from your research. Thank you so much for being here. So good to see you again. I'm Al McFarlane.
Well, thank you so much. We look forward to coming back. We're planning to do some programs at Sumner. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you too. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time.